Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this online masterclass with Wex. My name is Chaitanya Deshpande. I'm a nature and landscape photographer, and I'd like to thank Wex and Canon for making this masterclass possible. And today, I'm going to talk you through my thinking process, my planning, execution, and the way I go about taking my landscape and nature photos. Through this session, I'll talk about equipment, gear that I use, the apps that I use to plan for my shoots. I'll try and provide some tips, some tricks, and hopefully some useful pointers that should help you improve your nature and your landscape photography. First of all, I wanted to start here, just to give you a bit of an introduction, and then we'll be out in the field. I look at hopefully 2 or 3 locations that I can share with you, each having some different characteristics, and that should give you a good idea of some variety in terms of taking your photography outdoors. And I'll also take you through my planning process and how I go about thinking of an outdoor landscape or nature shoot. So, first of all, as you may have seen from my bio and the information that Wex has kindly put as part of this event, is that most of my photography is done in the mornings, right? So I'm an early morning person, if you want to call me that. And I think for my kind of photography, that is something that's absolutely key to me. So early mornings are important. Looking at the weather and planning around the weather is important, again, given the light and conditions that you get. And we'll see more of that when we are on site. And most of my shoots require a good deal of planning in advance, whether it's for the location itself, for the gear that I'm going to take, and in general to ensure that I have the best chance of getting the type of image I want. At the end of the masterclass, there will be an opportunity for you to ask me any questions you may have in the Q&A session. So please do so even while you're watching the video at the end, where we can discuss that. And if there's any questions that you would like to ask at a later stage, I'm happy to connect outside this session as well. Just to give you a little more detail before we head out, when I talk about the weather or planning, what do I mean? So as you can see here, just pulled up the BBC weather app, and there's so many others you can use. Clear Outside, you have AccuWeather. So there's a ton of applications available online where you can check things like this, where you look at the weather, you look at the temperature, you look at humidity, you look at difference in temperature, the dew point. Another thing that is important is also understanding the seasonal variations and when the sun rises, the angle at which it rises, the likely angle at which the light will hit a certain frame, etc. You can really get very, very detailed with this, and the more you do so, you will find that the more it rewards you. When it comes to equipment, I'm an out-and-out Canon user, and I've experimented quite a bit over the last decade or so with Canon equipment, Canon lenses. At the start, when you're figuring out the type of photography you most like, you have your wide-angle lenses, you have macro lenses. I bought all of them. I bought also some portrait, the 135mm f2 lens, for example. Absolutely beautiful lens that. But slowly you then kind of refine and realize the 2 or 3 lenses that you most depend on, and that's how I like to also look at my photography. Simplify things, look at your most kind of used and favorite lenses, and focus on them as you go along. Again, you'll see examples of this in the field when I talk through the type of lenses I use for different types of locations. And while this is not part of the session today, I'd just like to make a small point about what we do with our photos after we've shot them. It's photography is very, very accessible now, and there's so much data everywhere when it comes to photos being shared on various social media platforms, at home, etc. But I do think it's good to take some time looking at your photos once you're back home after having shot them. Printing them, I think that is absolutely very, very rewarding. It kind of completes the circle. You're not taking photos for the sake of taking photos, but you take them, you kind of come home, look at them, process them the way you like, edit them as required, and then sometimes print them as well. So it's a good habit, I think, to enjoy the final outcome as well, rather than having terabytes and terabytes of photos that you will have to continue doing backups of. So just a small thing from my side, which I've learned over the years in terms of enjoying your own photography. Beautiful morning in the South Downs. The reason I'm here today is going to show you how I go about my landscape photography. Absolutely lovely mist and rolling hills. The rolling hills, of course, are a feature of the South Downs, but the mist is an added bonus. And I've planned this morning so that we have the mist. As I keep saying, if you're out early, if the conditions are right, at this time of the year, when it's between autumn and winter, or even in winter, you can get some lovely mist in the morning. The reason I've chosen this location is because of my vantage point. As you can see, I'm a little high up, and I can pick out things in the landscape. The reason I say pick out is because I'm primarily going to use a 70 to 200, so a telephoto lens, a zoom telephoto lens for my landscape photography. And this is almost my go-to lens for landscape photos, because while a wide-angle lens is great to capture everything you see in front of you, a telephoto enables you to pick out the tiny details, look at a landscape in a different way, use that telephoto compression, as they call it, to your advantage, and we'll see examples of that very soon. And of course, the mist. I keep saying that it's my key ingredient to photography. I absolutely love the mist, and I'm going to make the most of that with the photos I get today. We're in the South Downs this morning. Got up nice and early, about 3 hours before sunrise, to be able to drive down here, reach in time. Winter and late autumn months afford you that time in the morning to be able to get to places that are a little far away, because sunrise, of course, is a little later. And I think that is the first thing that I'd like to talk about in terms of nature photography, is timing is everything. Of course, you need to know the location, you need to know where you want to take your photos. But once you know that, getting there at the right time, especially like me, if you are going to spend time taking photos mostly in the mornings, then I think you need to get there about 45 minutes before the sun rises. With landscapes especially, because you never know what is going to catch your interest, you will need to make that effort to get there early. Once I'm at the location I want to take my pictures at, that's the key element. Without the location, without being out for nature photography, you're not really going to take any photos. Today I've chosen to be out in a bigger landscape to show you some of my favorite locations in the mist, in the South Downs. But once you have that location, then I think there are two other elements that for me make or break your photograph. One, as I like to call it, is the hardware. So your camera, your lenses, your tripod, your filters, and any other accessories you need for your photography. And two is the software or the settings. So your exposure, your camera setup, how you're going to meter the image, and everything to do with the camera internally. When it comes to the hardware, I try and simplify it. Okay, so my go-to lens for most of my nature photography, and it's an approach that has paid off for me, but different people have different approaches, is I try and stick to one lens as much as possible. It cuts out the clutter, it cuts out any distractions, and yes, there will be some shots you may not get with this focal length, but that makes you work harder for a particular image. Of course, where you need a wide angle, you need a wide angle. Where you need, let's say, a 300 or 400 mm lens, you need that. But if I was to use one lens for 90% of the time, I use my 70-200 mm lens. On my Canon 5DS, I absolutely love the 5DS or the 5D series. This model specifically has a 50 megapixel sensor, so it's really good in terms of the images and how I can play around with them. If I need to crop them a little, it affords me that flexibility to do that. The other thing I'd say with landscape photography especially is, and to a certain extent nature photography, is that tripods, I do see a lot of people using tripods, and you need them where you need them. But again, for me, it's another element that complicates some of my workflow in my landscape photography. So if possible, I try and avoid a tripod. I can try and find some support where I need to, where it's early morning and the shutter speeds are very low. But if I can, with today's cameras, with the low light capability of some of the sensors, with the image stabilization of the lenses, it is possible in a few settings to do away with the tripod. Again, make no mistake, just like with lenses, I'm not advocating that you do away with your tripod completely, but I find myself 90% of the time not using my tripod. Just makes it easier for me, makes my bag lighter, and makes my thinking process about the photo that much more simple. In terms of my camera settings, again, I like to simplify things, and you'll probably notice this is a reoccurring thread through everything I've been talking about. I do like to simplify as much as possible, because cameras today are pretty good in terms of their capability on their own. What I see myself doing with the camera is actually creating an image and framing an image in a particular way. So the settings, while they're important, I try and keep the changes to a minimum. So once you use a brand for a longish period of time, like I have been doing with Canon, I intuitively know my settings, and when I'm out in the field, I know exactly how I want the camera to be set up without trying to make too many changes. What are the usual things you'd look at? You'd look at what your focal length is, what your exposure, your of course your exposure triangle, your ISO, your aperture, your shutter speed. But in addition to that, there's various little options that the camera gives you, and I'd encourage you to explore them. So for example, exposure bracketing, and you want to take a scene with 3 different shots. Sorry for that, spotted something in the landscape. But yes, you want to take a scene with 3 different shots, 3 different exposures, and then blend them together later. You can do that. You want to let the camera figure out how it wants to evaluate the metering of your image. So you can have spot metering, you have evaluative metering. A rule of thumb: always try and protect your highlights, because if you lose your highlights, then there is no way in post-processing you will get back those highlights. Once that bit of the image is lost, it's completely lost. To a certain extent, the same rule applies to shadows, but it's much more difficult to play around with the highlights in post-processing. So if you have to sacrifice something, let it be the shadows and try and protect the highlights. Okay, whether you want to focus manually or you want to focus using the camera's autofocus, again, this is a topic that's hotly debated. To be honest, once you have focused on your subject, it doesn't matter whether it's manual or auto. If the focus is correct, both are as good. With nature photography, if it's animals or birds, it's difficult sometimes to be able to work with a manual focus, because your scene is changing in front of you very rapidly. With landscape, it's possible to use manual, so you can set up on a tripod, shoot your landscape in live view, so using your camera's screen, zoom into the landscape and do your finer adjustments with manual. And that's what I'd recommend with landscape photography. But otherwise, for me, I often use autofocus. Next, focus points. So with today's cameras, gone are the days where you had only a few focus points to work with, and they were all centered towards the middle of the frame. You now have, like this one, 61 focus points, and you can move them around in terms of which part of the image you're looking at through your viewfinder to focus on. So the next thing I'd like to talk about, and in some ways probably what distinguishes each one's photography and gives it that uniqueness, is the actual framing and creativity of the shot. So you have arrived at your chosen location early, before sunrise. You have your camera, you have your tripod, you have your filters, you have all the hardware, as I call it. You have your camera settings down to a T. Now it's about actually taking the image, pressing that shutter. Here are some of the things I look for with nature photography. So one is the light. I spend hours and hours looking at various apps to tell me how the light will play with the landscape. So it could be the time of sunrise, it could be the weather conditions, it could be visiting that location, looking at the trees, looking at how in different seasons the light would hit the trees in a particular way, looking at shadows, anything to do with light. I think that is or has to be everyone's key element. Second, juxtaposition. For me, you can get a particular subject on its own, but if you can combine 2 or 3 or more elements in an image, so if you have an image of a deer by itself versus an image of a deer with the sun behind it, if you have an image of a deer with the sun behind it and a bird positioned somewhere creatively within the picture, I think it just adds various elements to the picture. So for me, juxtaposition is another element. The other thing is interesting anchor points, as I like to call them, in the photo. So in a landscape like this, where you have lots going on, there's many trees, with a telephoto lens, I typically zoom in to a particular area, look at a particular tree. You may find cows, you may find sheep. Use those as anchor points in your photo. It just gives that photo that additional bit of interest. Four is geometry. So there's always lines or curves that you see in the landscape. Nothing is ever straight, as they say in nature, but you can always find geometric elements that point towards the main subject in your image, or make the image creative. Mostly Canon equipment, as you can see. I've been using Canon for close to a decade now. Have seen no reason to change, especially with their lenses. I think they're fantastic. So from looking at my bag this morning, here's my kind of old workhorse, my 300mm f4, which I use mostly for my bird and mammal photography, but also sometimes for landscape photography to get that telephoto compression. The most used lens for me is this one, the 70-200mm. Absolutely brilliant, versatile, can be used for landscapes, for birds, for animals. Absolutely love it. And that is attached to my main body, which is my Canon 5DS. And I have my spare body here, my Canon 7D, which I still use for some of my wildlife and action shots if I needed to, attached to another workhorse, the 16-35mm wide angle lens. So other than the lenses, what do I have? Well, I have a Canon remote shutter release. Can be used for landscape photography early in the morning if you are set up on a tripod with low light conditions and a very low shutter speed, and you don't want to shake the camera. This is your friend. In addition to that, I have my filters. So that's my neutral density filter. Sorry, it's not as clean as it should be, but that's because I don't use it that often. Because in my landscape shots, I try to leave the sky out if possible. I think the sky distracts, unless there's good interest in the sky in terms of clouds. So it doesn't see too much use, but that's your neutral density filter. And I also have a circular polarizer to cut off that unwanted glare. A circular polarizer is one of the few filters that can't be readjusted in post-processing. So if you want that that effect that the circular polarizer gives you, then it must be used at the time of taking your shot. But remember that with a circular polarizer, because you're reducing the light that's entering your camera, you will need to compensate for that with either a higher ISO or a lower shutter speed. So there are some adjustments to be made. The other tip with landscapes is I'd suggest playing around with framing as much as possible. What one needs to remember is the way images are consumed these days has changed. So gone are the days where you only looked at magazines or computer screens for images. Most of the images these days are being viewed on your mobile or your iPad, which is inherently a vertical portrait mode viewing platform. So when you're looking at a landscape like this, I'd suggest thinking of how the image would look in a portrait mode. So to summarize this morning's outing, I'd like to talk about 4 things that I think are key with nature photography. The first one, and I can't emphasize this enough, get up early. Get up an hour or a couple of hours before sunrise, so that you plan in advance and you are at your chosen location at least half an hour before sunrise. Second, make sure you have everything you need for your photos. You'd be surprised how many times I've forgotten my memory card, my battery for the camera, basic things like that. So make sure you've packed your bag the previous night, that you've forgotten nothing, that your batteries are charged, everything you need, filters, tripod, whatever it is. Planning really puts you at ease the next day, because as I said, early morning start, you may be in a rush, you may wake up 15-20 minutes later than you expected. Third, again, this is part of the advanced planning. Study the location and especially the weather at the location. So today's example, I knew that it was going to be a bright day today. I knew that yesterday was bright as well. I knew that overnight there was a difference in temperature between the hottest part of the day yesterday and early part of today by about 10 degrees. The dew point was also around the same temperature, so 0-1 degrees. That means that there's a good chance of mist. The wind conditions were favorable, 3 miles per hour and below. If there's a trick or a thumb rule that I use, is if the wind speeds up 3 miles per hour or below and the other conditions are right, then you're very likely to get some mist. And finally, once you're at your location, everything's set up, you've arrived well in time, enjoy your photos. I mean, all the planning that you do in advance will help you do that, will make you more comfortable. You know, I found when I'm relaxed, when I've planned well in advance and I'm enjoying what I'm doing, that's when I get my best photos. So as you can see, I'm out this morning on a misty, foggy day. Conditions for photography are good, but it also means that we have less light to work with. So here are some of my tips for low light photography. With low light photography, what the camera struggles with, of course, is that main element, light. So if you take that away, all your camera settings change. And you're testing your camera sensor, its ISO capability. You're testing, what shutter speed you can use, what aperture you can work with. So here are a few things I do to compensate for that low light. One, tripod. You need to be able to work with certain apertures and shutter speeds, and at times that's just not possible handheld. So it lets me lower my shutter speed. It lets me work with certain apertures I'd want to work with. So let's say an f4 or f2.8. And in normal light, I may have had a higher shutter speed with those kind of apertures, but with lower light, I probably need to expose for a little longer. So a tripod is a key ingredient. Second, ISO. It really depends on what your camera can handle. But with a lot of the latest Canon cameras, ISO capability is quite good. I try not to go too high on the ISO. However, if I had to compromise, it would be the ISO and not, say, the shutter speed, because you want an image that's sharp, albeit with some noise, which a higher ISO will unfortunately have. But there's no point in my view having an image that's not clear or blurred or shaky, um, just because you had a low ISO and a low shutter speed. Okay. In terms of aperture, again, um, I like to work with good depth of field. So with low light, though, you have to adjust. So typically at f5.6, f6.3 and above. Um, but that's fine, because as the light changes, you can try and get creative. You can work with a lower depth of field as well. Um, Use the lack of light to your advantage. So if there's a certain section of the landscape you'd like to focus on, use a lower aperture. That's fine. It will mean that that section, if there's light on it, for example, will be properly exposed, and around it you'll have dark shadows or lesser light. But that's your creativity and how you use it. um, what I like about low light photography, or days when there's a lack of sunlight, is that you get good diffused light across the landscape, across your field of view, which means that you and your camera don't have to deal with harsh light, harsh shadows. Um, your dynamic range in terms of your highly exposed areas and your areas in shadow um, are not that different. Um, your subjects are often lit in a soft light. Next, lenses. With low light photography, I do tend to work with wide angle lenses, or not so much with telephoto lenses, because a thumb rule with photography is, if your focal length is say 70 mm, then you can get a good handheld shot at a shutter speed of 1 by 70 seconds, a shot that is not shaky. So with the 200 mm, it would be 1 by 200. Unfortunately, with low light, um, it sometimes is just not possible to be able to use those high shutter speeds. It does mean that if you have a wide angle lens, so let's say a 16-35 mm, at 35 mm even, 1 by 35, with your lenses image stabilization capability, yes, possible. 16 mm, definitely possible. So wide angle lens helps in that respect with low light photography. Of course, if you're on a tripod, you may say it doesn't really make a difference, but mounting your equipment with a big telephoto lens on your tripod system may not always be easy. So I'd suggest experimenting first with wide angle lenses in low light. In terms of your camera setup at low light, um, I'd recommend using your live view, um, because it's low light again, as you're typically mounted on a tripod. Um, you can look at the camera screen to see how the image in front of you is being exposed. The great thing about digital cameras is instant feedback. So I'd suggest keep experimenting, keep trying. You may want to have the image lit in a certain way on purpose. The low light, as I said, you can use the low light to your advantage. So have it on live view and experiment. And as you change your camera settings, your live view, of course, gives you that instant feedback. The second thing is, as you can see I'm near a water body or a small pond. I try and use reflections when it comes to low light, because whatever light you have, you can then double it. If you look at the scene behind me, the scene is lit by the reflection, as well as the ambient light. So if you can, if you are near a pond or a lake in low light, try experimenting with that as well. Try and get as close to the water level as you can. This morning on the field, nice and early, a bit of frost on the ground. You can probably see some in the background as well. I'm going to show you how I go about my photography when it comes to water, reflections, and some subjects that I find typically around water bodies. So whether they're birds or trees, especially on a still morning like this, reflections are the first thing that come to mind. There's probably going to be mist on the water, so we'll explore some elements of that. There's probably going to be birds on the water. That's one of my favorite things. So I'm going to show you how I try and create a frame around a subject when the mist on the water simplifies everything around it. So yes, looks like some very good conditions. I like to do most of my nature photography in the morning. Take today as an example. We're officially in the winter months, so that affords you the flexibility to get up a little later in time for sunrise. Very different in the summers, where I'm often up at 2:30 or 3 in the morning, and it really takes it out of you. But you know what, with the conditions that you get, with the light that you get, it really makes up for everything. Anyway, with winter, this is much easier. There's some mist lingering about, and that for me is my perfect recipe for nature photography in the mornings. You can see the heron out there. I'm going to take some photos. Now you can see how the heron is reflected. One, how the mist is dancing around the bird, and the reflections of the trees. So what I try and do is try and capture all of these things in the image. On still mornings like these, I love shooting beside water bodies. There's a good chance of mist. You'll always get good reflections. And in the winter, you can make use of the frost as foreground interest, especially with a wide-angle lens. While this scene can be shot with a wide-angle lens, I would suggest experimenting with tighter frames as well, zooming in to interesting parts of the frame for a more intimate composition. The other tip I can give you with photography on water is always keep changing the angle. Keep exploring, see what works best for you. If I go very low, almost the level of the water, the type of reflection I get versus now when I'm standing is very different. So I'm going to try and show you. Completely different mood to the image. You can remove any distractions. Trees, for example, the viewpoint is a more intimate viewpoint to the subject. One of the other key things with nature photography, especially animals and birds, is the more you know the species, the more you know the animal, the more you know the bird, the better your photography will be. So for example, I know that these geese in the morning at sunrise are going to take off. I may not have the exact position now, but at least I have a greater chance of being able to capture them, let's say taking off from the water, than someone who hasn't followed Canada geese and who's not aware of their movements and their activities during the day. Once you're able to understand your subject, and you can actually leave your camera at home. I often do that, or I try and do that, leave my camera at home, and then once I'm confident, even it may even take a year to come back to the same spot, but I'm guaranteed to have a better chance of getting the photos I want instead of just rushing into the image. If I had to summarize my top 3 tips when it comes to nature photography, especially around a water body, is first of all, get to know your environment and get to know the subjects as intimately as you can. Nothing can replace that experience. Once you know that, your photography, your photos are guaranteed to be better. Second, understand the light and how it hits that particular spot. I spend hours and hours trying to figure out which angle the sun will rise from, which season a certain part of the pond will be lit up, in which season will the trees look better from this angle. So understanding how the sun moves around the lake, especially if you're going to focus like me on photographing mostly in the mornings, I think is critical, it's vital. And third, if you're lucky, try and find a still, calm day with some mist. And we're blessed in the UK to have so many misty days. In some locations, I think you can get mist throughout the year if you know where to go, if you know when to go. So try and find a day that is calm. I'd say 3 miles per hour or less in terms of the wind. Um, um, Drop in temperatures overnight, clear sky in the morning, and you get a good chance of getting some mist on the water.